it's the last of the who questions for the day. And then tomorrow we move on to the what questions. So the who is my neighbour question, so I have no idea whether you got onto that, those of you who chose to work with the handout and to kind of ponder over the 3 stages of your life so far. Did you get to think about who God was for you, who you are for yourself, and who neighbour might be for yourself? So this is some just more ideas on the notion of neighbour. So I wonder how many of you have seen the movie The Frisco Kid? It was a very hilarious comedy. Good, Jennifer. Yeah, brilliant.
Oh, I saw it, yes.
Yeah, Gene Wilder.
Gene Wilder.
And Harrison Ford. Yes.
Harrison Ford, okay, yeah. There's this hilarious scene where Gene Wilder is playing an ultra-Orthodox rabbi from Poland who graduated last in his class in the yeshiva. And he's been exported to a Jewish community in Philadelphia to be their rabbi. They're really stuck for rabbis, so they appeal to Poland to give them a rabbi, and they send over the last guy in the class. So Gene Wilder comes over, and he's trying to find Philadelphia, and he gets totally lost. And at one stage, he sees this kind of a group of black-clad, grey-bearded, sombre-looking Amish men walking in file. And he runs up, oh my God, my people. He thinks they're ultra-Orthodox Jews. He says, Landsman, Landsman, Landsman. So Landsman is a term, it's a Jewish term. I mean, basically it means fellow countryman or compatriot, but it was used in the shtetls of Russia and the kind of the ghettos of Poland to mean fellow Jew, somebody on whom you could depend, because you are obviously as persecuted against as I am. So it's a way we bonded together through our persecution. So the word landsman takes on this meaning of recognizing a fellow traveler in the journey. But the movie continues. It's a hilarious movie. And so that's where I want to start today, with the notion of neighbour or landsman or brother. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the notion of brother, because that leads and that evolves and that it becomes eventually the notion of neighbour, and then neighbour evolves and becomes something else. So I want to look then at the notion of brothers, particularly in the Bible, because after a really shaky start. And then I'll talk about the evolution of the notion of brotherhood. So when you start reading through the Bible and you come across brother for the very first time, over the book of Genesis even, if you even confine yourself to the book of Genesis, you begin to see that the notion of brother gets off to a really, really rocky start. The first brothers mentioned in the Bible are Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. And Cain kills Abel. And in my opinion, it's basically God's fault. And so what happens is Cain is a farmer and Abel is a shepherd. And they both bring gifts to God. And so Cain brings vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, and Abel brings mutton. And God obviously has a liking for mutton. And he doesn't much like vegetables. So he rejects the vegetables and he eats the mutton. And Cain gets really, really upset. Why are you rejecting my gift and you're accepting my brother's gift? And God says, are you getting mad with me? Do you know who I am? Mm-hmm. So Cain goes out, since he can't beat up on God, he beats up on his brother, he kills his brother. And then God finds him and says, where's your brother? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? Am I supposed to be looking after the guy? And then God curses him, which leads to the first really ridiculous statement in the Bible. And that is, God now curses Cain. And he says, because of what you have done, your brother's blood is crying from the earth. Anybody who sees you now is going to kill you. Now, examine that for a few minutes. There's only 3 people on planet Earth at this stage. Adam, Eve, and Cain. Who in God's name is going to kill? Yeah, Cain. God is saying, whoever meets you is going to kill you. No, because of what you've done. And there's only 3 of them there. I can't imagine that having lost half of their family, that either Adam or Eve are going to kill Cain and just wipe the whole human race out. So it's the first ridiculous statement that you find in the scriptures. But we get off to a really, really bad start. One brother killing the other brother. Move on a little bit then, and you go to the story of Abraham and Sarah. Abraham's wife is a very, very beautiful woman. Her name actually means princess, but she's infertile. She can't have kids. And so as was the custom in the time, and in fact was the custom in the Kalenjin people among whom I lived, she took a slave girl, an Egyptian slave girl called Hagar, and she presented Hagar to Abram, and she says, I want you to have a child with this woman, and that child will belong to me. Now in Kenya, we had actually, there was a custom where when a woman got married among the Kalenjin people, part of the dowry that the husband's family had to pay to her family went to her directly. So the woman's family is losing a worker, so they have to be compensated for it. So the man's family have to pay the woman's family because now the man's family is getting a worker and the woman's family is losing a worker because most of the work in Kenya is done by women. Worldwide it's done by women. So part of the dowry that was paid to her family was given directly to her. And if after 5 or 6 years of marriage she failed to conceive, she would marry another woman. And we're not talking about a lesbian arrangement. We're talking about the fact that in an actual ceremony, she would marry another woman, give this woman to her husband, and the first child of that union was legally regarded as belonging to the first woman who paid the dowry for it. So this notion is very, very common all over the world. So she gives, Hagar to her husband, and she says, the first child of this union is my child. So Hagar gets pregnant from Abraham, and then she starts feeling really, really uppity, and she starts getting snarky with Sarah because Sarah can't conceive, and she has, she's pregnant now. So Sarah, tells Abram, send this woman away. I can't abide this kind of behavior. So she treats her so badly that the Hagar runs off into the desert while she's still pregnant. But finally, Abram convinces her to come back in. And of course, Sarah makes Abram feel like it's his fault, it's all your fault. If Abram had the ability to defend himself, he was, well, you told me to do it. It's not like I went and had an affair, but Sarah won't have it. So Hagar gives birth to a child called Ishmael. And Ishmael is the father of the Arabic peoples. Now, after 12 years, suddenly Sarah herself gets pregnant. There's a visit from God, 3 angels visit her, and they tell her she's going to become pregnant herself, and indeed she does. And she gives birth to a child called Isaac. And the little 12-year-old Ishmael is fascinated with his baby brother. And so he's playing with his little baby brother, and Sarah sees this, and she flies into a rage. And she said, Abram, get rid of that woman. I'm not having her, child inheriting from my child. Send her away. And Abram gives her a loaf of bread and a bottle of water and sends Hagar and her child off into the desert to look after themselves. And we're talking about real wimp. So now there's the second pair of brothers that are mentioned here, And again, you have a situation where, the eldest guy really loves his little baby brother, but they're not allowed to be together. There's another story actually in between those two, and it's the story of the flood, where all of creation is wiped out and only 8 people are saved. Noah and his wife and their 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, and their wives, only 8 of them left. So they survive the flood, and Noah becomes the first vine dresser, growing grapes. And he's the first drunkard ever recorded. He gets sloshed, and he's inside in his tent, and he's lying naked inside in the tent. And Ham, one of his sons, goes in, and he sees his daddy naked. He comes back out, and he starts giggling to the other 2 boys. Dad's inside. He's sloshed, and he starkers. And the other 2 guys, get really upset, and they get a blanket, and they back into the tent, and they cover their dad. And when the dad wakes up, the other 2 guys snitch on their brother, and for that, Noah curses Ham. And Ham is the father of the African nations. And that becomes the excuse. Ham has a son called Canaan. Canaan isn't even conceived at that stage, let alone born. And this becomes the reason why the Israelites, feel that they can enslave the Canaanites or commit genocide, and why the African nations are slaves to Shem and Ham. And we use this very, very same scriptural text to justify slavery in this country in the 1800s. We appealed to Scripture and said it was dictated in Scripture that the African people should be slaves to Shem and Ham. Shem became the father of the Semite people, and Ham and Japheth, at least, became the father of the European people. So Shem and Japheth now become the rulers of Ham and the Canaanites and the Egyptians and Africans by extension. So again, you get the brothers, 2 of the brothers snitching on another brother. So it's not a very good track record to date. Go back to the Abraham story. Now you got Ishmael, the elder son, and you got Isaac, the younger son. Now, Isaac marries a woman called Rebecca. And Rebecca gives birth to twins. One of them, the first guy that comes out, she calls Esau. And he's a really, really hairy child, and he's red. He's got red hair. He's covered in red hair. And he grew up to be a great, great hunter. And he's his dad's favorite. But the second son that she gives birth to is Jacob. And Jacob is a kind of a mama's boy. He's hanging around his mother all the time. So in two extraordinary events, Jacob, who's the youngest son, he steals the birthright from his older brother, Esau, through a trick. And then finally, when their father is really, really, really old, Isaac, and he's dying, he's completely blind, and he calls in Esau, his firstborn son. He says, I want you to go out, you're a great hunter, I want you to get me some venison and cook me a beautiful meal so that I can eat my last meal, and I'll give you my blessing. And so Esau goes off hunting, and the mother is listening to this, Rebecca is listening to this conversation, and she calls in the younger son, she calls in Jacob, and she says, here's what I heard your father saying. So now I want you to go out and kill a calf, and I'll cook it, I'll do it exactly the way your dad likes it, and you'll present it to him, and you'll pretend that you're Esau, and you get the blessing instead of Esau. And I said, Jacob said, he'll know I'm not, Esau, I'm really smooth-skinned and he's hairy. He said, don't worry about it. We'll put the hair of the kid that you kill on your arms. So when your dad feels you, he'll smell the smell of the wild and he'll think that it's really his firstborn. And so they do that. And Jacob goes into his father with the meal created by Rebecca. And he says, Dad, I brought you your meal. And the old man said, how did you get it so quickly? And Jacob lies through his teeth and said, your God, made me victorious in the hunt. I found something almost immediately, and here it is. And the father's saying, it's strange. The voice is the voice of Jacob, but come over, my son. And he comes over and he feels his arm, and the mother has put the calf skin on his hands, so he feels this. He says, the hands, they're the hands of Esau, but the voice is the voice of Jacob. I can't understand it. But he eats the meal, and then he calls him over, and he gives him his final blessing. About an hour later, Esau returns from the hunt, and he comes in, he prepares the food, and says, Dad, I have a meal for you. And the father says, what do you mean? He said, I went out hunting, and I found some game, and I killed it, and I cooked it, and here's your meal. And the father said, but you fed me a few hours ago. And then the whole story comes out. And Esau breaks down to you and says, Father, have you no blessing for me? And the father says, I only have one blessing. I can't take it back. I've given it to your brother. All I can say is, more or less, you're going to play second fiddle to your brother for the rest of your life. So at this stage, the mother reckons, things aren't going to be too good around here for the next while. So she sends Jacob off to her brother who lives in Mesopotamia. And he lived there for 20 years. And marries two sisters, Rachel and Leah. And marries two of the sisters. And he comes back after 20 years, and this period of time, Esau totally forgives him. He's one of the most forgiving characters in all of Scripture. Totally forgives him. So here's another case of two brothers, one stealing the birthright and cheating the elder one, but the elder one learning to forgive him. Jacob, in turn, has 14 kids. He has 13 sons and one daughter. And 12 sons are born after each other, and then there's a big gap, before the little girl called Dinah is born, and then a final born called Benjamin. But of all the sons he had, he really favoured Joseph. Yeah, and he made a special coat for Joseph, multicoloured coat. But Joseph was a dreamer, and he wasn't, shy about, saying how important he felt he was. So he had a series of dreams in which, he saw his mother and father bowing down to worship him and his brothers bowing down to worship him in kind of dream form, sheaves of wheat bowing down. And he begins telling his brothers about this. So they really got to hate him. Who the hell do you think you are? You think we're going to bow down to you? Or our parents are going to bow down to you? So finally, they sell him into slavery, and they persuade his father that a wild animal killed him and ate him. And the father's really, really, really grieving. So they actually sell their brother into slavery. There's actually 3 different accounts in Genesis, 3 contradictory accounts of how Joseph wound up in Egypt. In one account, he's killed. In another account, he's thrown into a pit. And then the Ishmaelites, a caravan of Ishmaelites is passing by, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites. In a third one, the Ishmaelites discover him for himself and bring him down into Egypt. But in any case, he winds up in Egypt, and he becomes the second most important person in the land after the Pharaoh. And during a tremendous famine in the country, he manages to save his own family. They come down from Canaan looking for food, and he finally divulges to them who he really is, and he saves the whole family. So here's a story where Joseph forgives his brothers for actually selling him into slavery. So you get this extraordinary, brothers, that relationship of brothers, treating brothers. If you fast forward then to the New Testament, there's a whole bunch of stories about brothers in the life of Jesus. So for instance, when he picks out the 12 disciples, Peter, Andrew, James and John, those first four are two sets of brothers. Peter and Andrew are brothers. In fact, Andrew was actually Jesus' first disciple. Andrew was a disciple actually of John the Baptist, and John is talking about the coming Messiah. And one day as he's talking, and Andrew is walking with John the Baptist, and there's somebody else with him that's not named, and Jesus is passing by, and John the Baptist says, "That's him, that's the guy I've been telling you about." And so Andrew takes off after him with some other disciple of John who is named in the Gospels. And Jesus hears these guys following him, and says, "What do you want?" And they're kind of stuck for an answer. What are they going to say? And Andrew says, "Dude, where do you live?" And Jesus says, "Come and see." And they come and they spend the whole day with him. So Andrew becomes the first disciple. And then he goes home and he says to his brother Peter, "We found the Messiah." And he brings Peter along. And Jesus is great at giving people nicknames. So Andrew's brother is called Simon. So Jesus says to him, "I'm going to nickname you. I'm going to call you Peter," which is a pun in the Latin, meaning a rock. You are the rock. Some rock Peter turned out to be. But so there's the first brothers. Then you have James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who are brothers as well. And Jesus gives them another nickname. He calls them sons of thunder. Whether it's that the dad was a kind of a loudmouth character, or the sons were kind of lightning strikers, or I don't know, but he called them sons of thunder. And then there are two James mentioned in the 12 disciples. And for some reason, the church in her wisdom calls one of them James. One of them is called James the Lesser. Now, how would you like to be called James the Lesser? You're one of 12 guys, the two guys called James, and you're called known as James the Lesser. So one of the James, is the brother of John, and the other is a brother of Jesus. So there's a story in Mark's Gospel where Jesus' brothers are named, and we're told that he had sisters. The sisters aren't named in the Gospel, but the brothers are named. 4 of the brothers are named, and one of them is James. And it is this James, actually, that becomes the leader of the church after Jesus dies. It wasn't Peter. Peter was not the leader of the church, in spite of Matthew's best attempts to make him the rock on which the church is founded. Peter became the leader of the church in Rome, in the diaspora. But it was James, the brother of Jesus, who was the leader of the church after Jesus died. And there's a great story. He lived until the year 61 AD, and then he was killed. He was murdered by one of the Herods. So there's the very first council of the church is held in the year 49 AD or 49 CE. And it's to address the question of whether or not Gentiles who become followers of Jesus need to convert to Judaism, keep kosher, and if they're men, get circumcised before they can be accepted as Christians. And there's a big debate going on. And there's a group of ex-Pharisees who have joined the Jesus movement, who are insistent upon, they're called the Judaizers in the Acts of the Apostles, and they're insisting that if a Gentile wants to be a follower of Jesus, he must convert to Judaism, keep all 613 precepts of Torah, and get circumcised if he's a male. So there's a big debate. So the very first council of the church, it's more like a community meeting. It's probably no bigger than this group here. And they're addressing this issue. And in the Acts of the Apostles, I think it's about chapter 15 or so, Paul stands up and he gives a report about what's happening in the Gentile world because of his preaching about Jesus. And Peter stands up and he gives his opinion. And John stands up and he gives his opinion. And then finally, James, the brother of Jesus, stands up and he says, "We've heard Peter say this, and we heard John say that, and we heard Paul say this. Now it is my decision." He didn't say it's my opinion. Peter gave his opinion, John gave his opinion, Paul gave his opinion. James didn't give an opinion. He gave a decision. He said, it's my decision. Here's what we're going to do. We are not going to insist that they become Jewish, that they keep kosher. We're going to just ask them to do four things, and they all have to do with blood. Refrain from drinking blood. Refrain from eating the meat of strangled animals because they contain the blood still in them and the blood belongs to God. Refrain from meat which is sacrificed to idols because the blood is poured out for foreign gods. And refrain from porneia. And porneia is always mistranslated as fornication. It's not fornication. It is marriage within the forbidden degree of kinship. You're not allowed to marry within a forbidden degree of kinship because of the bloodline and because of the fact that you're much more likely to create kind of genetical abnormalities. So the 4 prohibitions have to do with blood. Apart from that, no other prohibitions. But it is James, the brother of Jesus, who makes that decision. And then even more interestingly, when you read the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, it starts off by saying, Didymus Thomas say the following. And then he reports a whole bunch of the sayings of Jesus. Now, Didymus Thomas is actually a tautology because Didymus is the Greek word for a twin and Thomas is the Hebrew word for a twin. So he starts off by saying, Didymus Thomas, twin. I'm saying the following things. Now, of whom was Thomas a twin? And there's an esoteric belief system that Thomas was actually a twin of Jesus. Literally a kind of a biological twin of Jesus. So that's kind of esoteric, but take it for what it's worth. So you now see this extraordinary movement throughout the scriptural tradition of the notion of brotherhood, and how it changes from a fratricide to begin with down to the sharing of the new kind of a gospel, the good news of the kingdom of God. So there's a big shift in the notion of brotherhood throughout the scriptures. If you want to continue that evolution then in the course of brotherhood and take it out of a totally scriptural context and keep watching. Initially, brother just literally means a male sibling, same father, same mother. And then it's extended to a same father, different mother. So in, what would you call it, societies where men were allowed to have many wives, what is it? Polygamy. In polygamy, you got same father, different mother. But all the males of the father, even if they have different mothers, will still be called brother. So it's not just same father, same mother, same-sex sibling of the male side. It is any male, that's descended from the father who fathered me, even if it was by a different mother. In Kenya and in the scriptures, it then gets extended to any male cousin. So what we would regard as, cousins, male cousins, they would still regard as brothers. So brother gets extended from just male sibling, same father, same mother, male sibling, same father, different mother, to a male from any of my brothers of my father or my brothers of my mother. And then it goes on to the notion in Judaism of the landsman, the compatriot, the fellow Jew. Now, when it goes into the spiritual arena, it then gets extended further. And so in the monastic orders, they'll call each other brother. Brother Michael or Brother Matthew or Brother Thomas or whatever. They're not related genetically in any way, but they're together by religious association. And now you're going to extend the notion of brotherhood to any male, within the order. We extend it even further to the notion of a fellow pilgrim. So anybody on the journey, any companion on the journey, if they're males, can be called brother. So where's Kaji? Is he here today? Kaji. Kaji always calls me Brother Seán. Yeah? And an acknowledgement of the fact that, we are brothers. Kaji was born in Pakistan, I was born in Ireland, but we're brothers. And so this notion that you extend brotherhood to any fellow traveller, of the male gender, so it gets extended even further. I think there's a new phase, and it actually must mean all fellow humans. And it's not gender specific anymore. It's the realization that all the humans working with us or traveling with us is brother, to use the male term. And the shamanic traditions And particularly in our country here, Native American Indian tradition, all my relations. When Americans, Native American Indians talk about all my relations, they're not just talking about my first cousins and second cousins and uncles and aunts, and grandparents. They're talking about all living things. There's the four-legged brothers and sisters, and there's the two-legged brothers and sisters, and there's the 100-legged brothers and sisters, and we incorporate that actually really beautifully into our own liturgy in the Eucharistic prayer of the Cosmos. We talk about all of this, the winged brothers and sisters, and the finned brothers and sisters, and the four-legged, and the six-legged, and the eight-legged, and the 100-legged, and the 1,000-legged, that they're all brother and sister to us. I would extend it further, and I think that all cosmic beings, extraterrestrials, if they exist, and I'm convinced they do, extra-dimensional beings who live in a non-physical plane, angels, they're all brother and sister to us. So I don't like the term brother and sister anymore because they're simply placeholders. They're placeholders until we get to the realization that all manifestations of God, are part of our soulhood. So it's not brotherhood, it's not sisterhood, it's soulhood at this stage. So that for me is that's the extension of this notion of brother that we find initially in the scriptural tradition. Now, I want to build upon that then and extend that out into what do we mean by neighbour. So neighbour, as you look at it historically, has a very checkered history. So initially, by neighbour, you mean some kind of a special relationship. And initially, it's based on geographical proximity more than quality of relationship. So initially, it's just, the guys next door or the tribe next door or whatever. But in the Pentateuch, the Pentateuch means the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In the Pentateuch, people treated their neighbours really, really, really badly. The whole story of the Exodus, which never actually happened, the whole story of the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, and then culminating with David and Solomon, actually never happened. When you look at the historical record, and you look at the archaeological record, there was no such exodus and there was no such conquest and there was no such genocide as outlined in the book of Genesis, Exodus and Deuteronomy in particular. It never occurred in that fashion. Which is not to say there wasn't genocide being perpetrated by colonialist regimes and empires at the time. There were. And Judaism had to make up its own mythology to account for the fact that they were being discriminated against. They had just ended, 10 of the tribes had been wiped out by the Assyrian Empire in 721 BCE, and the last 2 tribes were exiled in Babylon in 589 BCE, and they were freed by the Persians in 539 BCE, after which they were attacked by the newly emergent Egyptians again, who had been powerful before and now are powerful again, and then subsequently by the Greeks, and then subsequently by the Romans, and so they're trying to maintain some sense of solidarity, and they create this extraordinary mythology in which they were great conquerors in their own days. And they create these characters called King David and King Solomon. And when you actually read the historical record of the times from non-biblical sources, and you do the archaeology, which Israeli archaeologists have done in spades since independence in 1948, David presided over a tiny little kingdom, as did Solomon. This notion that Solomon presided over all the land between the 2 great rivers, between the Nile and the Tigris-Euphrates, is total midrash. He had a very small kingdom that may have incorporated Judea and Samaria and the northern kingdom that was subsequently known as Galilee, a very, very small piece of land. So there's these wild exaggerations that all mythologies create. And so neighbour then becomes a notion of the tribe next door or the guys next door. And so they, according to the stories, which are untrue, gratefully untrue, they treated their neighbours really, really, really badly. They just wiped out one tribe after the next. And they operate under what was called the ban. The ban meant that you killed every woman, every child, every ox and every ass. Now, in fact, there's this horrible story in the book of Joshua, I think it's in chapter 6, where the last command, that God gives to Joshua, They've crossed the Jordan. They're now in the land, the promised land, for the first time after 40 years sojourn. They've crossed the Jordan and they surround the city of Jericho. And God is telling them, I'm going to have the priests circumambulate the city, blowing their horn 7 times, and the walls will fall down and then go straight ahead. And in Joshua chapter 6, verse 20, it says, kill every man, every woman, every child. In fact, kill everything that breathes. That's the term you find again and again and again. Kill everything that breathes. In other words, all mammals. Not just all humans, all mammals. And they go ahead, allegedly, and they do that. There is not a shred of archaeological evidence that Jericho's ever fell. It's one of the oldest continually inhabited cities on planet Earth. Itself and Damascus may well be the 2 oldest continually inhabited cities on planet Earth. There is not a shred of evidence in the archaeological digs that Jericho was ever destroyed or the walls ever fell. But the story is that they destroyed it. And one of the most upsetting stories in the Pentateuch, there's a story, it's somewhere in the book of Deuteronomy, maybe around chapter 30 or someplace. And the backstory is this. It's coming to the end of their journey across the desert after 40 years. And they encounter a group of people called the Midianites. Now, the backstory to this is Moses is married to a Midianite. When Moses lived in the land of Egypt, and was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter, but he's secretly an Israelite, but he's actually raised by the Egyptians. One day he comes across an Egyptian beating a slave Israeli or Israelite, and Moses kills the guy. Moses kills the Egyptian. And he comes back a few days later and he sees the same Hebrew man fighting with another Hebrew. And he says, what are you doing? You guys are brothers. And the first guy says to him, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? So Moses does a runner and disappears off into the desert. And he meets a guy, a girl called, what was her name? Is it because of a Z? What am I trying to think of? What's her name? Zephyr? No, it's not Zephyr. I think for a minute. It'll come to me in a few minutes. So he meets this girl and she's watering her father's flocks. And other kind of herdsmen are driving her away because she's a woman on her own. And Moses intercedes and he helps her to water her flocks. And so she takes him home to meet her daddy. And her daddy is a man called Jethro. He's given 2 names in the scriptures. Sometimes he's called Jethro, sometimes he's called Raoul. And he's the father of this woman. And so this man gives his daughter to Moses in marriage. And Moses has 2 sons by her. And so she's a Midianite, and he's serving his father-in-law, who's a Midianite, who saves him, in the desert. And now 40 years into the exile, they encounter the Midianites, and Moses sends them out to slaughter the Midianites. Despite the fact his own sons are half Midianite, and his wife is a Midianite. Yeah? And the soldiers go out and they kill all the males, all the Midianite males. Tens of thousands of males get slaughtered in this. But they save the children and they save the women for themselves. And they come back with all this booty. And Moses said to them, what are you doing? What are you coming back with all these women and kids? And they said, well, we killed all the fighters, we killed all the warriors. Moses said, that's not what I told you to do. I told you to kill everybody. I want you to kill everybody except the virgins, those who haven't known man. You can keep those for yourselves. But I want you to kill everybody else, including the kids. And they wipe out everybody. And that's the last act, allegedly, before they actually enter the promised land. Here's Moses, creating a genocide for his neighbors, his own wife's family, and the parents or the grandparents of his own 2 kids. Yeah. And so this is how neighbor got treated very, very often in the scriptures. According to the scriptures then, Joshua enters the promised land in the year 1210 BC. Without Moses. God won't allow Moses to enter the promised land for his impatience. And now Joshua, and his descendants will spend the next 200 years allegedly conquering the land because there are lots of different tribes living there. And the final conquest is 1010 BCE with the fall of Jerusalem. And allegedly David is the king who conquers Jerusalem and makes it his headquarters. Now, and so the conquest of the promised land begins in Jericho in 1210 BCE, with allegedly the fall of Jericho and the massacre of all men, women, and children, and all mammals. And then it ends, the conquest ends 200 years later with the capture of Jerusalem by King David. Now, fast forward, 1,000 years to the time of Jesus. And Jesus is going to be asked the question, who is my neighbor? And he tells this great story about the Good Samaritan, about a Jewish man, who's beaten up and left for dead at the side of the road, ignored by a Jewish priest passing by, ignored by a Jewish Levite passing by, and saved by a Samaritan. You can, if that were modern language, you could say an Israeli, who was beaten up, left for dead at the side of the road, abandoned by two fellow Israelis, and rescued by a Palestinian, and brought to Jericho, healed, and this man, this Palestinian, pays his hotel bill for him. Now, this is the story that Jesus tells. But there's a big, big significance in it. Because Jesus is redefining the notion of neighbour. Neighbour now is not just the landsman, the compatriot anymore. A neighbour now includes the enemy, so-called. And so there's this extraordinary, kind of reversal where the conquest of Canaan began in Jericho and ended in Jerusalem. And the new conquest will start in Jerusalem and it will end in Jericho. And it will be a spiritual conquest. It'll be the kingdom of heaven, not the promised land, a geographical place filled with milk and honey. It will be the spiritual kingdom in which it will start in Jerusalem and reverse the conquest and end in Jericho in an act of extraordinary love and compassion by an enemy for an enemy. And so, in some senses, the entire trajectory is reversed and the whole teaching about neighbour is reversed. Neighbour is not a landsman. And it certainly isn't somebody whom you deprive of their land or their produce, and whom you kill in the process. It's realizing that everybody is a brother and sister and neighbour to me. Now, the extraordinary, really upsetting thing is that the followers of Jesus have been really followers of Joshua. That the Christian church in its history, through its crusades, and conquests and inquisitions and the conquest of the New World when we came here in the 1490s and the 1500s, that they have been followers of Joshua, not of Jesus. And it's interesting because the names are almost identical. Jesus' name in Hebrew is either Yehoshua or Yeshua, which means God saves, and Joshua of the Bible is exactly the same thing, God saves. So they both have exactly the same name. But how God saves in the Joshua story is very different from how God saves in the Jesus story. How God saves in the Joshua story is by the genocide of the people who existed in the land before us and who got in our way of owning the territory. And the conquest of Jesus is the turning of all the enemies into neighbours and into friends. And unfortunately, the history of the Christian church is that we have been followers of Joshua. We have not been followers of Jesus. So to kind of bring it full term then, what do we mean by neighbour very often in our own country right now? And again, I'm seeing the same cleavage, the same rush into kind of taking sides, forgetting that we're all brother and sister and soulhood members and dividing ourselves up into camps. And so now if you're on the liberal left, your only neighbour is somebody on the liberal left. If you're on the conservative right, your only neighbour is somebody on the conservative right. If you're a follower of Donald Trump, the Clintons are the enemy. If you're the follower of Hillary Clinton, Trump is the enemy. So we're dividing our nation right down to the middle, and we're creating, instead of a dialogue where we're trying to listen to each other, we're creating shouting matches, talking heads on television, trying to whip up anger on both sides against the other people. And this is what the neighbourhood has come to mean in our country, in our times. The Good Samaritan must be turning in his grave. Jesus had the kind of foresight to resurrect after 3 days, so as not to have to witness this. So this is the mission of neighbour for us in our country, in our world right now. It is to overcome this extraordinary dichotomy that we've created and fostered in our country, in our time, where neighbour has been totally, fractioned into partisan politics, economic models, the oligarchy versus, the bottom, 90% of people who are just scraping by. It's anything but the message of Jesus Christ. So if we are serious about our mission, And that'll be, something we'll look at tomorrow. If we're serious about our mission, and if we're serious about creating personal cosmology, we have to wrestle head on with this dismemberment of our country right now, and a dismemberment of our world right now. Anybody who's saying anything that's making you anxious or angry is not a follower of Jesus Christ. They may be a follower of Joshua, they are not a follower of Jesus Christ. If your only response to anybody on the planet, no matter what their politics are, what their economic status is, what their IQ level is, what their skin color is, what their socioeconomic status is like, what their religious affiliation is like, if you're not regarding everybody as your neighbor and loving and reaching out and forgiving if you have to and assisting if they need it, if that's not your reaction, then you're not a follower of Jesus Christ. You're a follower of Joshua. Which brings me to the last point. The real meaning of neighbour. So, incarnation, as I said, involves many, many illusions. Primary among them being the illusion of separation. That we're separate from God, that we're separate from each other, and that we're separate from nature. This, I think, is the greatest illusion under which we labour during incarnation. The notion of separateness. And the essence of, as I said this morning, the essence of the mystical journey is to heal, dissolve that illusion and grow ourselves back step by step into the realization that ultimately there is only God. Even the soul is an illusion. The soul is the first illusion on the way out, and it's the last illusion on the way back in. But this illusion of separation creates all human suffering. All human suffering. Whether it's what we're doing to nature or what we're doing to each other, it's all predicated on a notion of separation. And so healing that notion of separation becomes paramount in our journey back. Now, if I think my neighbour is other, the word other is very, very interesting because it has two possible meanings, which are antithetical to each other. To say that somebody is other could mean that they're not me. So I separate myself out by saying, you're other. Jane is other to me. She is not me. And therefore my relationship with Jane is predicated on the fact that Jane is not me. Or it's predicated on the notion of the other is another. So in some senses, it's another me. It's another version of God. That's, appearing as a woman. This version is appearing as a man. So when you say somebody is other, you can be differentiating and calling them not me, or you could be realizing they're an other me. They're just another version of me, or another version of God as me, or as God as you. In some senses, we're all doppelgangers at a soul level with each other. Even if physically and physiologically we don't resemble each other, we're absolutely doppelgangers. So we have to realize that what appear to be separate parts is an illusion to create the excitement and the journey and the exploration of incarnation. So if I go out to an apple tree and I see a beautiful apple, and I reach up and I pick the apple, and I think, no, the apple belongs to my hand because it was my hand that plucked it. And the mouth says, me too, me too, me too, me too, please. And I don't want to give it to my mouth. If I keep the apple in my hand, because the hand insists that the apple is mine, I picked it. And the eye says, dude, I saw it. You wouldn't have been able to pluck it if I didn't point it out to you. And so it belongs to me. And the leg says, hold up a second. You saw it, but it was 100 meters away. I'm the guy who brought you there. The hand wouldn't have been able to reach the apple if I hadn't brought you there. And then the mouth says, guys, you can hold it in your hand as long as you like, and it's going to be of no benefit. If you give it to me, I'll digest it. And I guarantee you, I will create energy that will benefit every part of us. The legs will benefit, the eyes will benefit, the taste buds will benefit, the hand will benefit. So what appear to be separate parts, each of them are operating independently of each other, it's a unit in which the different parts are members of the same team. So the eyes see it, the legs bring you there, the hand plucks it, the mouth dissects it, the stomach masticates it or reduces it to energy, and then that gives energy to the whole body, and now everybody benefits. That's what other means. That's what neighbour means. They're not separate from you in the sense that they don't belong and it's a competition. They're only other in the sense in which your hand, your eye, your leg, and your stomach are other parts of the same organism, all of which are dependent upon each other in order to feed themselves. So to use another kind of a dumb example, you're a woman, you're not three separate cells because you wear a bikini when you go to the beach, and you wear an evening gown when you're going to the graduation ball, and you wear a trouser suit when you're going to the shopping mall. You're not three different women. You're a woman in three different situations, and you're wearing a costume that represents a different activity that you're going to get engaged in. But you don't think that you're multiple personality disorder because you have a bikini, an evening gown, and a trouser suit. They're just costumes that you wear. All of these 37, 38 are gowns that souls are wearing in order to play different roles in the drama called incarnation. An African man and an Asian woman are just simply two different manifestations of God or of Source. There's only one body, there's only one life. And tomorrow I want to go into much, much more detail talking about this one life. So all sentient beings are neighbor to us in the sense in which the eyes, the feet, the hand, the mouth, the stomach are all just members of the same organism. And so the highest spiritual practice of all, every mystical tradition will tell you that the highest spiritual practice of all is to be able to see God in everything. And so I just want to end with two great teachings from two great teachers. The shortest lecture, the shortest homily that the Buddha ever gave was an occasion where he's walking with his disciples and he bends down and he plucks a flower and he holds it aloft. And they're all going to say, okay, dude, what's the story with the flower? And he's just holding it up there. And they're saying, okay, flower, right, we get it. Aren't you going to tell us what you mean? And all of a sudden, one guy down to the back of the room breaks into this big smile. And the Buddha says, Neil, you got it. Neil realized that if you really see the flower, you see God. You see everything. Thich Nhat Hanh put it very beautifully one time when he said, a flower consists totally of non-flower elements. You take a flower, if you took away the water and the minerals and the soil and the sunshine and the wind, there wouldn't be a flower. So a flower consists totally of non-flower elements. So if you really saw a flower, you see everything. You see God. And Jesus said it again using the same kind of imagery, where he says to the disciples, he says, look at the lilies of the field. Now in this instance, he didn't, there's one here. Look at the lilies of the field. If you really see that lily, you're seeing Jesus who pointed it out to you. You're seeing God who created it. You're seeing everything if you really, really see that lily. It's not where you look that decides what you find. It's how you look. If you don't know how to look, you can look everywhere and you'll find nothing. If you know how to look, it doesn't matter where you look, you'll find everything. Because we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So we see things through the blinkers of separation. And so if there was maybe one mantra that I'd like to kind of meditate on today, would be just that thing, that it is not where I look that allows me to be in contact with God, it's how I look. And it doesn't matter a damn whether I'm looking at a homeless person, an oak tree, a mountain, or an avatar. If I really know how to look, I see God. Namaste. So we got an extended period now between now and dinner. We can utilize it any way we want. We can have a kind of discussion for a period of time. We can break up and go back out and walk in nature. We can whatever small groups assemble, you can do that. So whatever you like to do, and we can do it. Neil.
Have you ever heard of Deepening?
Yes. Yeah.
He talks about the 17 levels of awareness.
Okay. Brilliant.
The lowest being shame.
Okay.
But he talks about a level called the level of love.
Okay.
And he says it's not an emotion, it's a state of passion.
Right, totally. Absolutely. Absolutely is. Yeah. So, do you want to say it again, Neil?
David Hawkins said there are 17 levels of awareness. 17 levels that we know life or know ourselves. And the lowest being shame. And we get to a level, maybe level 14, where he talks about love. But love is not an emotion, it's a state of consciousness. And you have to walk up to it. And then he made a further statement that if most people live in the lower levels of consciousness, but if we can move everybody up one level, we could transform the whole world. Which is
That's beautiful, beautiful, yeah.
try to do. We have to try and move everybody up one level.
Thank you.
Do you want to add to that, Dale? I know, Dale, you've read a lot of stuff by Hawkins as well.
Yeah, well, I've never heard that.
Okay. Yeah, it's a beautiful teaching. It's absolutely right that, in some senses, vibrations kind of dictate the kind of the way in which we experience matter, our emotions, our feelings, our love. That we're, in some senses, vibratory beings, and this was the great teaching of Hinduism as well. That the 7 bodies of which they speak are just different frequency levels, and so that I believe that every physical object in the world has a vibratory rate which is unique to it, including the organs of the body. The heart has a vibratory rate which is different from the kidneys. So physical things have a vibration or frequency. Emotions have a frequency. Mentation ideas have a frequency. Love has a frequency. So it's a question of how you increase your frequency level, that you work your way up through these levels until finally there's only the vibration of source that's left. And so any movement up that scale is going to have immediately, huge consequences for all of our relationships, as interpersonally, intercommunally, internationally, and with our planet. Beautiful. Thanks. Janie.
A teacher of mine was saying that the emotions are like styrofoam in a swimming pool. If you just get distracted and take a nap, it starts raising. And that God is always trying to pull you up from one frequency to another with your emotions.
Brilliant. Beautiful. Thanks a lot. Johanna.
Georgia O'Keeffe had a question, and she said, does anybody ever really look at a flower?
Okay.
And she's the one who did the paintings of the interior of flowers, so you can allow yourself to go in and really look at nature or whatever you can go on this journey. As you're saying, you can see God.
Yeah. So is that... Right, totally. Yeah. And so it's a great exercise, actually a great meditation to do sometimes, is to try imagine being a flower or a rock or a mountain or a river, and try to inhabit that experience from the inside out. Not saying, I wonder what it's like in the sense of, let me make up a story or a fantasy. I've defined imagination for you many times. I don't believe that imagination is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. That's fantasy. That's not imagination. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift your state of consciousness, enter into different dimensions, interact with the energies and the entities that reside in those different dimensions, learn from them, and then bring back the learnings into this state of consciousness and cross-fertilize it with, our sensory awareness, or normal physical consciousness. So little children access that place very, very, very easily. They can imagine all kinds of things. You'll take a little child, and you give him an expensive toy for Christmas, 3-year-old. And he's going to tear open the wrapping paper, and there's this box in which, whatever the gift is, and he's going to throw away the gift, and he's going to play with the box. Because the box could be a submarine, or it could be an aircraft carrier, or it could be a supersonic jet, anything. It's only limited by the child's imagination. And so the more basic the item is, the more play the child is able to have, the more kind of ability the imagination has to run with it, because the child is shifting states of consciousness and interacting. So to imagine that you are a flower, Not to say, wouldn't it be cute if I could imagine what it would be like to be a flower? What would the root system feel like? What would it be like to have the breeze waft me around? What would it be like to have sunlight on my face? But actually to get inside and as a flower, to experience it, what it's actually really like to be a flower on planet Earth. There's I came across this great piece from Deepak Chopra one time, that flowers actually change colours in order to regulate the temperature on planet Earth. They have the ability as a species, and I don't mean just a species as to like lilies as distinct from roses, but that flowers in general, plant life in general, has the ability and the sensitivity to change colour in order to attract energy or to kind of send back energy. If it's getting too hot, they'll repel it. If it's getting too cold, they'll attract it, literally by changing their colours. So they're kind of mystics in some senses who are operating out of a compassion for Pachamama, for the planet itself, and trying to cool her fevered brow when things get too hot, and warm her up when it's getting freezing. The very flowers themselves are doing that. Trish.
I want you, if you would, be willing to expound a little bit on your thoughts of Carl Jung saying, one who looks inside dreams and one who looks outside awakes.
That's beautiful. One who looks outside dreams, one who looks inside awakes. It reminds me of a statement by Rumi. He said at one stage, "Yesterday I was very clever. I tried to change the world. Today I'm very wise. I'm trying to change myself." Yeah. So it seems like it's the same notion that if we're looking at externals in order to understand what life is about, then we're just dreaming in the sense that we're just making up stuff. That's not important. So you awaken because when you look inside, if you look inside deeply enough, if you look inside beyond the ego and you access the soul inside, then you're in contact with the essence out of which everything emerged. And so that's ultimate reality. You've gone right back to source by digging deeper and deeper and deeper inside. If you're looking to the externals, try to understand reality, you're going to be fooled by, inconsequential kind of artifacts. You're not going to see the essence by just looking at the outside. Unless you're able to start with the outside of an object like this and then look inside that object. But if you're fascinated by external circumstances, then you have a political system which is focused on our differences. If you look inside, you realize that every human being on the planet bleeds if you cut them, and is sad when they experience a loss. So you look inside them and you're dealing with reality. You look outside and all you see are the differences. Yeah, Neil.
Just like Jesus said, the kingdom of God is within.
Exactly. It's very interesting that you find that in Luke's Gospel. And Luke, the New Testament is written in Greek. And the phrase that Luke uses there, he says, the kingdom of God is en mesoi. And the Greek term en mesoi has actually two meanings. It means within you and it means among you. So you would discover the kingdom not by trying to look into the heavens or looking for extraordinary events, but looking deeply, deeply, deeply inside, or in community where two or three are gathered together, there am I in their midst. If the two or three are together in love, not in war or in haggling or arguing with each other. So you're going to find it among people by identifying what we have in common, or within yourself by going deeply below the psyche and below the persona and below the ego into the soul self. Yeah. Great.
So one of my most interesting neighbor stories I have is there's a rental house across the street from me, and it's never really been upgraded, and for the last 10, 15 years it's been rented out to sort of, lower class people, just, it's cheap, the guy doesn't put any money in it. And there's always been kind of a problematical rental house because just the turnover and the type of people that rent it. And so there was one time there was this couple, and he was a true Neanderthal. He was just kind of primitive, really aggressive, hostile. He was just so negative, and I hated him, and I hated his energy. And he was hanging out in his garage, and he would have his hip-hop music and his rap, violent music, and it was going right into my bedroom. And I was just getting more obsessed about hating him. And then I just said, wait a minute, I might be co-creating some of this energy. So I said, God, what spiritual tool can I use? And then I said, well, I can't wish him hell, I should wish him well. Nice, and he can move into another house with a bigger garage, and hang out with his buddies. It's not a problem for the neighbors. I swear to you, within 3 weeks they moved out. I don't know, but I know that he did move. And I've still had some kind of dicey neighbors live there. But now whenever it's quiet, I just try to say thank you. When it's calm or peaceful, thank you. Even though I kind of got a bipolar guy living across the street there now. But really, that really worked. Not to wish
These
them
people need
well.
you.
I wish them well.
You're a stage on their healing process, Ingrid. Yeah. They come to be your neighbours on the way to kind of healing. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
You know, when you said truly imagine yourself a flower, you know, my initial instinct is like, I would have absolutely no idea how to do that. So I want to thank you for that metaphor. Like, in relationship, if things are too, you know, hot or angry, or, you know, you can negotiate it that way. You can cool things down, respond in a way where you can diffuse or cool things down, or vice versa. You know,
That's
so,
brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So there's a great French proverb that says to understand everything is to forgive everything. Because if you really, really understand, everybody is coming from a place that can be explained, you know, by knowing their story. And if you know their story, you understand where they're coming from, where they're at, and then you can wish them well instead of wishing them hell. And then at that stage, you can forgive them and offer them your blessing, which is precisely what Jesus is saying. You know, you've heard that it was said to the people of old, you know, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Or you love your neighbour and you hate your enemy. I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. And so when you understand, you know, then it gives you a totally different appreciation and relationship of why we're here and why we have the situations we have in our lives right now. Sharon.
We had, we had neighbors, or have neighbors, who have in the past been, I should say they were irritating. I was irritated because they fought a lot and I mean, I thought he was killing her, literally, and I thought, wouldn't that be terrible if we didn't, you know, didn't call the police or something. We never did, but Bill just was straightforward and told them over the fence, you know, we will call if you keep this up. And everybody was, you know, very tortured by listening to this all the time. And yet they, you know, they were family. And I thought, what a saint of this child who chose to incarnate into that family, and she loved playing piano. I never met the child. I saw the parents a few times. But I just decided, and I know others had called the police, and eventually they decided, I guess, had no effect what I did, but I would just start singing the song, you know, Peace is Flowing Like a River, and wish them peace and love, and it just made me feel better. And I may not have had any effect, but it helped me. And now I don't feel, even though they gutted our tree from the other side. You know, just put a concave hole in it. But we didn't even bother talking to them about it. But that's okay. The tree came back to life, and you know, I knew that they had a lot of problems, and they exerted them in interesting ways.
So can I just make one comment that reminds me of, you know, the extraordinary patience of nature with us human beings. When I moved up here 25 years ago, you know, there was an old cabin that had been built in the 1880s by a family called the Derricks, and it was they hadn't lived in it for 40 years. They'd moved down into Healdsburg, but it was just a wooden building with, you know, big gaps between the boards, and whoever put the roof in it, it was a corrugated iron roof. And if you've ever done any building with corrugated iron, you know, there's the troughs and the kind of the valleys. You have to nail it through the top, not through the valleys. Whoever put up this roof had nailed it through the valleys. Every single nail in the building was acting as a conduit for water. So the first night I slept there, it was leaking in 40 different places. I had cups and bowls out underneath it and I was up on the roof at 2 o'clock in the morning with a big bucket of tar pitch trying to seal all the holes. Yeah, so at one stage I had to put a new roof on it. And so I put these shingles. So I put a new roof on, I'm putting the shingles on it, and at the edge I'm cutting off the excess pieces and they're falling to the ground. And when the project was finished, I went around to try to pick up all the pieces of shingles that had fallen around the house. And I got most of them, but I missed a few of them. And a few months later, I discovered 2 or 3 more in the high grass. There's big high grass, and there's this shingles in the middle. So I pull up the shingles, and there's nothing underneath. It feels to be like dead. There was yellow grass there. I said, oh, God, I killed it. And then I realized there was this extraordinary hive of activity, all kinds of beetles and maggots who needed that kind of cover in order to flourish, and they're having a ball down there. So it wasn't like I threw the shingle down and nature said, that's it, I give up, I can't do anything here, I can't make grass grow, that's it, it's going to be barren forever and ever, amen. Nature just came back and said, okay, let's play with this one. What can we do with the shingle? Yeah, I think I know what I can do with shingle. Maggots, beetles, worms, and it just had a blast. That no matter what we do to nature, it responds with this extraordinary patience and this extraordinary creativity. And it's this extraordinary dance that nature does between parsimony and extravagance. Nature will always find the easiest way to do something. You take a river from its source and you run it down to the ocean. Nature will find the ideal course for that. And there's a beautiful mathematical formula. If you take any of the great rivers of the planet, the Nile, or the kind of the Euphrates, or the kind of the Amazon, and you measure by plane the distance from the source to the ocean, you measure that distance, and then you go by boat and you measure the distance, on the water. And you divide the distance on the water by the distance from the air. Do you know what number you get? Pi. Pi. Yeah. As it weaves its way from source to ocean, and the direct direction, you want to divide them by each other, you get pi. So nature finds this extraordinary, elegant, simplest way of doing what it needs to do. So it's parsimony, and it's at the same time, it's extravagance. You look at the millions of colours of flowers that nature has produced. Why? Just for the fun of producing colours. So this dance between extravagance and parsimony, which is a real kind of an example to us to live life in a parsimonious fashion by leaving a very light footprint, and at the same time as excitedly, as lovingly and as artistically as you can in your relationships to everything and everybody. Yeah. So thanks for that example of the tree that they gouged.
Well, actually, that reminds me of deformities in wood, and whether they be healthy things or just attempts to heal. I find them beautiful. When we went took Trish to the big basin yesterday, or was it the day before? I lose
Sunday.
Time is just everything. But I'm always attracted to odd shapes of wood and deformities or seaweed creating beautiful collages on the beach with combinations of some shells in between, and I think I could just put a frame around this, in my mind's eye. And I spent maybe an hour looking all over the beach and photographing all these beautiful collages that nature made out of just, moving onto the beach.
So if you love deformities, you love the human family.
Yeah.
Yeah. Artemis, you were trying to get in.
Well, I think you've kind of answered my question like 10 different ways already, but I still sort of have the question.
Sure.
We have examples a lot lately of, we have a lot of new neighbors coming into where we live in the desert.
Okay.
And people coming, the housing costs are lower, and people are trying to get out of big cities where the costs are higher, and a lot of people come out and come for different reasons, and a lot of those reasons sometimes revolve around seeing money symbols. And the desert is a really fragile type of ecosystem. It takes a long time
to recover.
Learn how to be respectful of it. And so we currently see a lot of new people coming into the neighborhood and doing strange things like decimating all of the beautiful, creosotes that take thousands of years to form their rings, and then planting 50 palm trees, which take a lot more water than the desert has to offer.
Spare.
And then wondering, it's just like any kind of your neighbor beating your spouse. When that discernment of
Right.
when to say something and how to say it. I know to always come from a place of love and wishing someone well, but sometimes it feels like, well, if Gandhi never did anything, you know, I mean, there's a time for action, and I just sometimes have trouble grappling with when and what to say to be loving.
Right. That's beautiful. That's beautiful, Artemis. So I think it is, I believe that love comes in 4 basic forms. I call them the 4 C's. You know, the first one is confirmation. The second one is complementarity. The third one is compensation. And the fourth one is confrontation. And I've used the example of like American football, you know, the Super Bowl, to kind of illustrate this. So confirmation is you go out to play in the Super Bowl, you know, and one of your guys scores do you call it a try or a touchdown? A touchdown. One of the guys scores a touchdown. And you say, way to go, buddy. All right. So we're all behind him. We love him because of what he's achieved. So that's loving by confirmation, the attaboy. The second one is loving by complementarity. So we all got different roles on the field. So there's the kind of the quarterback, and there's the receiver, and you know there's the nose guard or whatever they call them, the grunting and the big guys in the front line. You know, but we all have different parts of the team. We can't all be doing the same stuff. And so there's the complement. We love each other by playing complementary roles to each other. It's the second way of loving. The third way of loving is compensation. And so one of the guys drops the ball, and now it looks like there's going to be a turnover, you know, and the opposition are going to grab it, and you rush in and you grab the ball before the opposition can get it. So you're compensating from the fact that one of your own teammates made a mistake. So that's the third way of loving, compensation for a mistake that's been made by a teammate. And then there's the fourth one, which is confrontation. So the quarterback is the kind of guy, he wants every time that you snap the ball back to him, he wants to run the entire field and, you know, and score the touchdown himself. He'll never throw the ball to anybody else. And he gets sacked every time he tries it. And after 2 or 3 tries, the coach calls him and says, dude, you know, you're supposed to, the reason that there's other people on the team is that you're supposed to throw it to them and let them do the running. And the quarterback says, no, I want to be the star of this show. So he gets the next snap, and he tries to run again, and he gets sacked again. And the coach says, dude, sit on the bench. We're putting in the substitute quarterback here. So it's confrontation. But even confrontation has to be done in a loving way. It can't be done out of anger, you know, or kind of rage or whatever. But we have a duty to confront. You know, we live in a situation where our planet is being really, really badly treated. We have a duty to stand up and say, this is not good enough. You mentioned Gandhi. And Gandhi stood up to a situation where he took on the greatest empire of the day, arguably one of the greatest empires of all time. By success you mean geographical spread all over the world. The sun never set on the British Empire. And without speaking a single angry word or you know, doing any violent action, he defeated the greatest empire of his day in a matter of 10, 15 years, using the Salt March, you know, as a way. So symbolic gestures and training people to confront in a loving fashion. And Gandhi was lucky enough that he got to see the fruits of his labour, although he got assassinated, you know, shortly afterwards. But he got to see the results. Some of us may not live to see the results of the way in which we're loving. It may well be that planet Earth is going to suffer a lot more before we come to our senses, you know, and clean up our act. But if we have done our part, we've confronted what we need to confront with a love and a respect for the enemy figure, even in this, eventually everybody's going to wake up and see that we have to change how we're doing life on planet Earth. So having the patience and the courage, you know, to be able to confront lovingly is the trick. Yeah.
You know that he offered Nehru to be the president of India because he didn't want Pakistan to break away from India.
Yes.
And Nehru refused.
Yeah.
Because he wanted the Muslims.
Yeah.
That's how.
Yeah. It's interesting that his favourite form of protestation and confrontation was fasting. Yeah, going into these fasts. So he's prepared to self-suffer but not cause suffering to other people in order to try and achieve an objective. Yeah.
He also learned about non-violence from Terence McSweeney.
Yes, exactly. Do you want to tell Terence McSweeney's story?
Yeah, Terence McSweeney was, when Ireland was becoming independent, he he devised a system called non-violence. So he was elected Lord Mayor of Cork by the by the locals, but the British didn't want. The British wanted to appoint the Lord Mayor, and so he decided that he'd go on hunger strike. So he went on hunger strike for
72 days.
yeah, and the British had to force feed him because you get a lot of attention from all over the world, including Gandhi, and I think Gandhi was working British. He was working on the British, and not Home Office, but he had a government job in England, and also the former leader of the Vietnamese. I'm not sure on that, but I think what his name is now. He was there as well. So they learned that non-violence was another option for getting over, for getting rid of tyranny. Because if you do it in the right form, it'll show up the opposite. It'll show up the tyranny of the
oppressor. Yeah.
And so he died after
72 days. Yeah.
But he had set in motion a way of dealing with tyranny and bringing it down.
Yeah. Great story. Yeah. Yeah.
His 100th anniversary is coming up in about 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's his name again?
Terence McSweeney. Yeah.
He died in 1922.
22, yeah.
1922?
1922, yeah.
So I want your opinion, because you come from Ireland, but you've been here for a long time, so you can look at things from different perspectives. So when you look at our country and the divisiveness that is in our country, and personally I think a lot of that hate is fomented on purpose. I just kind of want your input on where you can conjecture or what you see happening with this country.
Okay. So I have a theory that when I look at world history, I call it nomadic empire. That when you look at the history of the planet, empires which are a fairly recent phenomenon, they only became possible with the agricultural revolution, which was about 3000 BCE. Before that, people, most of their life was spent in trying to getting food. With the agricultural revolution, we developed mechanized plows with the ox-drawn plow, so we could mass produce food. And we developed ceramics, which glazed pottery, which allowed us to store food for long periods of time without water spoilage. And you could put a bung in a big jar of grain and keep it for years and years and years. So we learned how to mass produce food and how to store food. So then, like everything else that we invented, we weaponized food. So now empires became possible for the first time ever. Some strong person could grab the food of a community and only dish it out to those who were obedient to him. And you could burn the supplies of the enemy or salt their fields, which meant that they couldn't grow food for 10, 15 years. Or you could steal it. Had the ox-drawn plow, so you could steal food in huge quantities and take it to your own place. So we weaponized food. And that was the beginning of empires, where we had the leisure time. We invented mathematics and philosophies and writing, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. But we also developed empires. And I watched that the empire has migrated. If you go from, beginning maybe let's start even with the Middle East. It starts with the great Akkadian Empire, about 3000 BCE, and then you get the Sumerian version of it a little bit further to the west, and then you get the Babylonian version of it, and then you get the Assyrian version of it, and then you get the Egyptian version of it, and then you get the Greek version of it, and then you get the Roman version of it, and then you get the Spanish version of it, and then you get the English version of it, and now we have the American version of it. So it's a migratory empire. And we are the current empire of the world. And every empire does the same thing. It makes the same mistakes again and again. What starts off as a democratic movement or whatever winds up being taken over by some kind of oligarchy who have no allegiance whatsoever to the country in which they're resident. So the military-industrial complex, which is currently using American military might to force its will on the world. We have 130, we're in 130 different countries. We have no business being there. We're there for economic reasons. We're not spreading democracy. We're stealing resources, whether it's oil or whatever it is. And we have a military that will defend that and work it for us. So those people have no allegiance to America. They're not Americans in the sense that they're doing this for us, the man and woman in the street. They're serving an oligarchy. And the same group of souls in previous incarnations served an oligarchy which was British. And before that, they served an oligarchy which was Spanish. And before that, an oligarchy which was Roman. And before that, an oligarchy which was Egyptian. And so it's this rotating empire. And we're still not learning from it. We're going through the same phases now that all the other empires, you see all the same signs of the implosion beginning to happen, in our country, in our time. So at some stage, some civilization is going to have to wake up to the realization that you don't conquer, you don't create progress by conquest. That instead of the journey starting in Jericho and ending in Jerusalem, it has to be a journey that starts in Jerusalem and ends in Jericho. And Jesus said that 2,000 years ago. And people who call themselves Christians and a nation that calls itself a Christian nation is actually a nation which is following Joshua. The same mindset and the same system. And, we face really bad days ahead. And this did not just start, with our recent elections. This began shortly after World War II. World War II may well have been the last, really, if you want to talk about just wars, that we have fought as a nation. Everything else has been conquest since then. Cultural conquest, economic conquest, military conquest. And we're paying the karmic price of it as a nation. Because karma is not just an individual, not the result of just cause and effect on an individual basis. There's a community karma that we operate in as a group, and the price of which we have to pay as a group. And there's a national karma that we will have to pay as a group. And unless we get our act together as a nation and we begin to undo some of the damage that we're doing to our world at this stage, we're going to pay the price for it. And I see at the moment this empire seems to be shifting across the Pacific into China, and China may well be the next great empire. We can wait for that to happen, and then we're going to be the subdued people, or we can wake up at this stage while we still have the time and start operating according to Christian principles. But shouting at each other across the political divide is not going to get us to that place. Go ahead, Janina.
This notion of other me and not me.
Yes.
And the notion of all separation creates suffering. I struggle with the other me that creates suffering.
So I didn't say all separation creates suffering. I say all suffering is created by separation. So there is, okay. So it seems like a subtle distinction. It's a very important distinction. Yeah. So it's not that all separation creates suffering. It's that separation creates all suffering. So there are some kinds of separation. For instance, your right hand and your left hand. The right hand washes the left hand. If you didn't have two hands, it'd be very difficult to wash your other hand, your two hands. So there's a separation which is necessary for incarnation, but it's the illusion of the separate self, and it is necessary for incarnation, as long as we don't identify with it. So when Jesus says, you're in the world, but you're not of the world, you're in the world, and therefore you experience separation, but you can't identify with the separation. Separation is an artifact of incarnation, and as such, it needs to be recognized and worked with, but not identified. So it's the identification with separation that creates the suffering. If I see you as other to me in such a way that there's only a particular piece of pie left, and if you get a bigger piece, I'm going to have a smaller piece. That's the separation that creates conflict and suffering. Now, it creates greed in me, and it creates anger if you manage to get the big piece before I can get to it. And so I think it may have been Ramana Maharshi who said at one stage that all human suffering lies in the gap between the ego and the soul. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny gap. between the ego and the soul. But all human suffering lies there. And that separation, that's the separation. We think we are our ego. We operate as if I am Seán ÓLaoire, and I'm not. Seán ÓLaoire is a role I play for this incarnation. Who I really am is an eternal being who volunteered for incarnation. So if my identity is with my soul, there is no suffering, because I'm as happy for your success as I am for my success. I'm really happy that you got the big piece, because it was just another me getting the big piece. You know, if I identify with the ego, you know, whatever you got, I didn't get. And that creates the suffering there. Jennifer.
Well, speaking of the ego, I've also, I know you're talking about letting go of the ego. I've also heard of it as an acronym, edging God
Out. Beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah.
Is to get to the source, we really have to get past the ego.
Yes.
So that I just thought, with all that talk, that just kind of came.
That's great. So I think that if we're serious about our spiritual journey, we have to be serial killers. We have to commit 4 murders to be enlightened beings. The first murder, and I'm obviously exaggerating in the sense in which Jesus exaggerates, like when Jesus said, you know, it's harder for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get to heaven. That's a wild exaggeration, obviously, until you understand what he means by this. So what I'm saying is, you can't become a spiritual person unless you commit 4 murders. The first murder, you have to murder the ego. So this identification with the physicalized, incarnated, what's sometimes called skin-encapsulated ego. You have to stop identifying with that. You got to kill that. Not in the sense that you obliterate it. You need the ego. You can't pay taxes or stop at red lights or tie your shoelaces if you don't have a working ego. But I'm saying killing it in the sense that you have to realize it's not the master. It's meant to be a servant. So the first murder, you kill the ego. The second murder is you have to kill your father. And by killing your father, I don't mean you committing patricide, that you get a gun and shoot your dad. I don't mean that. I mean that you have to transcend your culture of origin. That whatever culture you were brought up in, you know, you have to outgrow it. Not in the sense that you have to deny it, you know, or kind of dismiss it. But like Jesus in the temple at age 12, he says, you know, I have to be about my father's business. But the father he was talking about was not Joseph, who was standing there being angry with him for being missing for 3 days. He was talking about God, the Heavenly Father. So you got to kill your father. You have to transcend your culture of origin, or your religion of origin. The third murder is you have to kill your guru. There is no guru who can take you all the way. The guru can take you some of the way, but you're going to have experiences that the guru didn't have. And so the guru can't give you a map that's going to take you all the way. You have to have the courage at some stage to kill your guru. And I don't mean to abuse somebody who's been your teacher or be ungrateful for what she has taught you. But you have to be able to realize that there are some places that you got to go on your own. So that's the third murder. You have to kill your guru. And then finally, you have to kill your God. If you're a Buddhist, you say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. If you're a Christian mystic like Eckhart, you'll say, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. And so whatever theologies you've created, or whatever cosmologies you've created, and it's very important that you create your cosmologies. You have to learn to outgrow them and to kind of constantly update them. In the first lecture, it was Sunday night now, I told you it's very important to keep updating your cosmology. It didn't take me 5 minutes, within 5 minutes at the end of the lecture, I was forced to update my cosmology. I went down to the back of the room, and Michael Choi, and where's Bill Miller, and somebody else confronted me and said, you know that story you told about the owl? That the owl can't, you know, move its head around? They said, that's not true. An owl can do almost 180. I was thinking the owl can't move its eyes sideways, so I had to apologize. Mea maxima culpa. I got my facts wrong on the very first lecture. I had to update my cosmology within minutes of creating it. So we have to kill our cosmologies on a regular basis. And that's the ultimate scientific method, actually. When you look at the scientific method, I don't care whether you're a scientist of, whether your physics is your field, or mathematics is your field, or psychology is your field, or geology is your field. Basically, the scientific method consists in the following steps. It starts with observations in your field, whatever your field is. You make observations that give you data points. The second thing is you start looking for possible patterns in your data. So you're trying to identify, are there any possible patterns here? The third stage is you think you've identified a possible pattern. So now you create a hypothesis to explain what the pattern might be. And then you set up an experiment to test your hypothesis. And if it turns out that your hypothesis answers the data, then you have to make sure it's replicated in somebody else's laboratory. Because all scientific inquiry is based on statistics, and statistics do not give you causal connections. They give you correlations, probabilities. So if there's a 95% probability that there's, that this A is the reason why B happened, we accept as science as causation, but it's not causation. It's probability theory. You can't prove anything in science. You can give probability measures. If it's less, if there's only a 5% chance that it could happen by random, then you accept, you can work with that. So you have to replicate it in somebody else's laboratories to kind of make sure that this is not just a statistical aberration. It's the next stage. The next stage is now, you've now uncovered a scientific principle, a single principle. Many, many different studies will throw up different principles in the field. When you've got enough principles together, you've created a model in the field. Now you've got a scientific model of your field. Now that model seems to explain all your scientific data. But slowly, slowly, new anomalous data begin to raise their heads. And now you've got to kind of tweak your model to accommodate the new data, because the old model wasn't really adequate. Now it's bulging at the seams to try to create, space for the new data to fit into the old model. And at some stage, so much anomalous data present themselves that the old model doesn't work anymore. And now you've got to create a brand new model that can explain all the old data and all the new data as well. And that happened to us twice in the 20th century, with relativity theory and with quantum mechanics. Now, the very same thing has to happen in our spirituality, in our cosmology. We have to go through the very same fields. I wrote a whole section in the last book I did on this, the spirituality of science and the science of spirituality. There has to be a science to spirituality. As a spiritual seeker, you have to go through the same kinds of steps that the scientist, the physicist, the geologist goes through. You make observations. You try to recognize patterns in the data generated by your observations. You try to see, is there some kind of, hypothesis that could explain the apparent pattern? So you set up some kind of experiment to test that. Karma is a way of testing it, cause and effect. You think, okay, I think I've identified what the possible hypothesis is and that it's true. I now have to kind of confirm this with other people who are doing the same kinds of spiritual growing. If the mystics of Islam and the mystics of Christianity and the mystics of Judaism and the mystics of Christianity are all coming to the same conclusion, I can be pretty sure, okay, that's a valid hypothesis. Now we've created a principle. Now we continue with our exploration as spiritual beings, and we create a whole bunch of other spiritual principles, the cosmic laws that Maria talked about the other night. Now that gives us a model of spirituality. But at some stage, new anomalous experiences and data present themselves, and now I got to tweak my model. The other one wasn't quite, sufficient. And so I tweaked my model to accommodate the new experiences of the new data. And at some stage, so many new kinds of mystical experiences are happening that the old model is radically inadequate, and now we have to reinvent that completely. And that happened, hugely during the axial age between 800 BCE and 200 BCE. And I think it's beginning to happen in our world again. So I created a term for that years and years ago. I call these people mysticists. That the future of spirituality and the future of science are intricately bound up with each other. Science will not make any further progress until it admits to consciousness as the ground of all matter. And spirituality won't make any further progress unless they approach it in a scientific fashion. And so that's where I see that we're headed. Karen?
Would you say, if you think this is another axial age that's getting going, could you give us some sense of where you see the movement?
Okay. Where is the movement happening if this is another axial age, as I suspect it is? There's an extraordinary modern movement, it's less than 20 years old, called interspirituality. And it's a movement where the spiritual people cross-culturally and cross-denominationally are beginning to meet and to dialogue with each other. You get the Thomas Mertons of the world talking to the Dalai Lamas of the world, or the kind of the Thich Nhat Hanhs of the world. And this happened. There's a whole literature emerging in this field just in the last, 20 years. And so they're called it the interspiritual movement. And it's the kind of the transforming and transcending mere denominational affiliation. And what they're finding is that the mystics of all traditions have much more in common with each other than they do with the theologians of the systems out of which they're emerging. And so the future is not going to be theologians dialoguing with each other and trying to come to some kind of concordats, agreements, our separated brethren, where we're not going to persecute you anymore, but you still can't receive communion. If you're a Methodist, they won't allow you to receive communion in the Catholic Church, although you're our brethren, but you're our separated brethren still. So the theologians are not going to get us there. So this new movement is going to be an interspiritual movement where the mystics and the physicists, the quantum physicists, there's a lot of great writings. There's a guy called Robert Lanza who wrote two famous books called Biocentrism and Beyond Biocentrism, which is pointing out that as long as science is bogged down in the notion that the mind is an epiphenomenon of the brain, we're not going to get any further scientifically, unless we realize that the brain is merely a transmitter of consciousness, and that all of matter, and I'm going to talk about this in much more detail tomorrow when I talk about my understanding of life, that all of matter is simply an articulation of mind. And so consciousness is primary. And until science gets that, science is not going to make any more further progress. And until religion gets it, that it's mysticism, is the future, that Mother Church needs to untie the umbilical cords that are holding us tightly and allow us to get off the bus and walk in the desert on our own and then compare our experiences. Religion is going to bog down. So the future, the axial age that we're going through now is very young, 20 years old at this stage. It's the interspiritual movement. And it's a powerful movement, but you have to know it's there before you can start searching for it. Yeah. So I'm sure if you were just to plug in interspirituality in a Google search, you'd find 100 titles by 100 mystics from 100 different denominational backgrounds.
Is that Robert Lanza?
Robert Lanza, yes. Z-A, yeah. He was voted one of the 100 greatest thinkers in the world several years ago. He's a brilliant guy. I think he's a biologist by training, but he's written this too. And in the last, just on the 14th of March, I submitted the manuscript of the book I've just finished to a publisher called the New World Library. I don't know if they'll accept it or not, but to do that, we had to, I'm working with an editor in Philadelphia, brilliant woman, Kate Seán, and she compiled a list of complementary titles which are dealing with the same kinds of areas that I was dealing with, and trying to show that it's part of a new movement in spirituality. And she unearthed 5 or 6 powerful books written by credentialed scientists who are operating from the premise that it is consciousness and spirit, in some sense of the word, that's the origin of everything. And that until we begin to factor that into our scientific models, we're not going to make any further progress. And until spiritual people are prepared to make spirituality a scientific endeavor, they're not going to get much further either. So there's a whole bunch of new books on this topic. So if you put in Robert Lanza or just put interspirituality, quantum mechanics and spirituality, those kinds of things, you're going to find a whole bunch of books literally written in the last 4 or 5 years that are dealing with that topic. Johanna.
What do you mean by to have spirituality have a scientific, what was it?
Yeah, it has to be a scientific endeavor. Yeah.
Can you explain how that looks in the future?
Yeah, so I told you what the scientific method is. It's observation, recognition of pattern, hypothesis, testing, replication, creating principles, creating models, tweaking the model, updating the model. That's the scientific method. And you have to have the same scientific method in spirituality. Observation, data gathering, pattern recognition, hypothesis, experimentation, replication, creating principles, creating models, and then tweaking the models and updating the models. So you do the very same thing with your spirituality that you did in your kind of scientific.
Are you saying that one can look at like a thin place in that way?
Yes, yes. So the great, right, the great tool, the great tools of a kind of the physical sciences are observation using our sensorium and experimental methodologies. That's how we arrive at our truths or our principles or our laws in science. It's through observation and through experimentation. That's basically how it's done in science. In spirituality, it's also done, but instead of microscopes and telescopes, you're using meditation and altered states of consciousness. These become the tools or the instrumentation. So I've used an example with you years and years before. I just drag it up again if I can remember it. And it was a dream I had years and years and years ago. It actually came as a dream that I then unpacked when I woke up. And I had this vision of a cylindrical skyscraper. A round building, cylindrically shaped, multi-storied skyscraper. And it was accessed underground. And there was an elevator that went up through the center of this building and then opened out onto a corridor. And off the corridor opened rooms, 8 rooms, and just for the fun of it, there were 8 rooms. And so each room, if you imagine now you're in a cylindrical building and the elevator is coming up, the elevator shaft is coming up through the center, and when you get off the elevator, you find yourself in a circular corridor, and there are rooms opening from the circular corridor, 8 rooms. So when the front wall, that you enter is a curved wall. There's a door in the middle, and you go in, and it's a pie-shaped segment. The back wall is curved as well. So each room is going to have that configuration. It'll be a curved front wall, straight side walls, and a much bigger curved back wall. And in my dream, I go into the ground floor, room 101. And I see a mural on the wall. But it's done in charcoal stick figures. So it's like what a 4 or 5 year old child would draw of a person, with sticks for legs and a stick for a neck and stick for hands and kind of a little ball in the top. So I think, wow, interesting mural. And then I come out and I go along the corridor and I go into room 102. And room 102 now is the same mural, but it's done in colours. And I say, wow, interesting. I thought that looked good, this looks better. So I go from room to room to room on floor 1, and I see, in fact, that it's a single mural, and that by going into room 101, I was only seeing a tiny slice of the pie. But now going into every one of the rooms on the floor, I get the entire mural. I think, wow, this is great. Now I understand the mural. But then I say, I wonder what happens if I went to floor number 2. And I go up into the elevator, I go back up, now I'm floor number 2. And I go into room 201. And I find now that where it had been kind of stick figure drawings on the first floor, they're coloured, realistically drawn in the second floor. From room to room, I see the same pieces of the mural, but they're all done realistically in kind of real colour. I go back into the elevator and I go up into the 3rd floor and I go to room 301, 302, 303, 304, and I find that what I'm looking at is the same mural, but they're holographic 3-dimensional images of the mural. Now, I only managed to get to the 3rd floor. I don't know what I would have seen if I had gone to floor number 4. But what it represented to me was that any floor represents, a stage, a state of consciousness. The rooms on the first floor represent different states of consciousness. Waking consciousness, dreaming consciousness, nature mystical consciousness, non-dual mystical consciousness, imaginative consciousness. So all the rooms on one floor represent different states that you can access. But in order to get to different stages, states don't change you. You can have an LSD trip and have a great spiritual experience and then go back to being just a run-of-the-mill character because it hasn't changed you. You had an experience, but it didn't change you. The rooms or the floors represent the stages of evolution. The floors represent states on any one level. Waking consciousness, dreaming consciousness, meditation consciousness, whatever. But to grow through the stages, you have to have the courage to elevate yourself to get onto the elevator. So what happens very often is most people are creating their cosmologies because they've gone into a single room on the first floor. And they're making now their cosmologies from stick figure drawings in one room. They're not even seeing the whole mural on the first floor. And they certainly haven't had the courage not just to perambulate around all the rooms on the first floor, but to have the courage to get in the elevator and go up and see what it's like on the second floor or the third floor or the fourth floor. That's what the mystics do for us. They don't just familiarize themselves with all the states of consciousness on any one floor. They take the elevator and they look at the stages of consciousness as we move from level to level. Karen?
So, just a quick question. So, if the way in which a person sees life is it's for physical manifestation and some energetic kinds of things, and maybe some form to thoughts and that sort of thing, that is still states of consciousness simultaneously.
Absolutely, absolutely. They're all on the ground floor. Okay. Yeah, they're all just states. And you can be on the ground floor and you can access all the states, and it's not going to grow you. You're going to have really interesting experiences that you then build your ego. Wow, you should see what I just saw, or let me tell you what I just learned. And it's just ego. That's all that's happening. You haven't grown at all. No matter how many states of consciousness you've managed to access, you haven't grown until you have the courage to get on the elevator and go up to the next level. So you have to grow. If you're not changing, if you're not becoming a more loving, prejudice-free person because of your spirituality, you're on the ground floor. And even if you've been into all the rooms on the ground floor, you haven't grown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does that actually mean I don't sit on cold rocks? Don't sit on cold rocks.
Okay.
You've said that to me several times.
How many years has it taken you to figure that one out, Susie?
I thought of that before. I just said to Anya that
That's
it
brilliant.
means but I don't sit on cold rocks.
You got it.
Just trying to confirm it.
Hang around, baby. You got a lot more to learn.
Am I wrong?
You're dead right. You're dead right. After how many years, Susie?
14 and
14.
a half. And I was thinking this morning, maybe I'm ready to move on. No.
Rome wasn't built in a day.
Yeah.
Guys, can we take time out and just get out into nature and kind of change the energy? And grub is at 6:30. Thank you so much for your patience and hanging in here today.